Hello everyone, and let's come back to our British gentleman Charles Darwin. And in particular, I would like to debate the question whether this nice man with the impressive beard was actually a racist. And there's actually a myth that is existing surrounding Darwin that he was not a racist, that Darwin's hatred of slavery reflected his beliefs in racial equality. And this view is probably a myth, as recently pointed out in a book on the myths of Darwin, and this is in particular the article of Eric Peterson. So let's look into the article. So the article first starts with establishing some context, and this is particular that in May 2020 we had widespread protests in the US against police violence, and racism impacted various sectors, including academia. So that was what the protests were about. Social movements like Black in the Ivory and Shut Down STEM pressured university to address historical white supremacy in both visible and subtle ways. Actions included removing statues, renaming buildings, and creating new courses. Then, as academia scrutinized racial legacies, Charles Darwin's legacy came under review, despite being historically seen as an unlikely target. Darwin's family ties to abolitionism and his opposition to polygenism were initially seen as evidence against racism. So if we read it concretely, some, Jim Watson of double helix fame perhaps most glaringly, made for easy targets, but Charles Darwin seemed an unlikely one. For starters, Darwin was Wedgwood through his mother's side. Josiah Wedgwood cast the iconic "Am I Not a Man and a Brother" medallion, the unforgettable symbol of 18th century British abolitionist movement. And in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, published in 1871, Charles Darwin, son of and husband to Wedgwood, attacked the justification of polygenism, the scientific theory of that day that insisted blacks and whites had separate ancestors. However, in 2021, with the 150th anniversary, there was the anthropologist August Fuentes who criticized Darwin's Descent of Man for justifying empire, colonialism, and genocide. Fuentes argued that Darwin's racism influenced his scientific conclusions, so it's highly relevant, actually. Darwin was frequently and notably more modern in his thinking than most Victorians, they claimed. The Descent of Man, the second of Darwin's trilogy extending his abstract of origin species, Darwin demolished the slavery-justifying view of different races as separate species. Beyond merely reforming Victorian biology, this group claimed descent inspired later anti-racist perspectives. And this is probably true to a degree, but we have to see the full picture. So Charles Darwin hated slavery, just like his Wedgwood family, or so it is taught in many biology classrooms. So why is that? This is probably because we need a myth, right? We need the startling modern thinker on issues of race, indeed a Proto-Boasian anthropologist. This is a myth. And like the author here, Patterson, or what is his name? Yeah, he attempts to actually debunk it. So against this article of Fuentes, we had like a backlash. A group of scholars defended Darwin, claiming he was ahead of his time and opposed to slavery supporting theories. They argued that the Descent of Man contributed to anti-racist perspectives. That's what I've just read. So so far for the introduction. Now let's come to the argument. So here we see that Darwin, as influenced by the Wedgwood family tradition, displayed a strong distaste for cruelty towards both animals and humans. Near Rio de Janeiro, I lived opposite to an old lady who kept screws to crush the fingers of her female slaves. I will not even allude to the many heart-sickening atrocities who speak of slavery as a tolerable evil. So Darwin first-hand experience in Brazil, 1833, that was during his journey at the HMS Beagle, the brutal realities of slavery. And actually, Darwin learned to support here the abolition. Darwin expressed pride in Great Britain's move to eradicate slavery, a sentiment he shared in a later letter to his sister. So he wrote, what a proud thing for England if she is the first European nation which utterly abolishes it. Darwin felt that living in slave countries only strengthened his opposition to slavery, contrary to what others had predicted. Yeah, and like we also see here a kind of weird appreciation of the word I'm not supposed to say, right? A much higher estimate of the character. It is impossible to see and not feel kindly towards him. Such cheerful, open, honest expression and such fine muscular bodies. And the text rightfully criticizes. In this widely quoted passage, Darwin revealed both warm feelings for the enslaved person, physique and cheerfulness. We may not read it as a cringe-worthy repetition of the happy slave anecdote ever after baked into the pernicious American lost cause myth. So Darwin was never racist in the conventional sense of the word. That's actually the myth. He expressed his dislike of slavery and his admiration for the Brazilian black population. So that then is the myth. And Darwin actually published works consistently arguing for the shared ancestry of all humans, a central aspect of his scientific contribution. This is basically what this article says. So now, however, let's look at Darwin's thoughts on race. So what certainly stands out in this regard is his correspondence with his former geology teacher, Charles Lyell, that basically taught him to think in the deep dimensions of time. Darwin believed in gradations of intellectual powers between different races, implying a significant but not insurmountable gap between a Hottentot and an orangutan. Maybe I wrote that wrong here. I guess it's an orangutan. Darwin suggested that less intellectual races were being exterminated, a process he saw as natural selection in action. Quote, I look at this process as now going on with the races of man, the less intellectual races being exterminated. So this is what he says here, right? So we see here already a view that supports a certain kind of racism and genocide, right? So let's look at his views on polygenism, the idea that we have more than one common ancestor. So Darwin indeed disagreed with the idea that different human races were distinct species, but he did not challenge the hierarchical view of races presented by others. He remarked on the extermination of lower races by higher civilized races as part of natural selection. Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. We find that struggle of existence, improving the face of Earth. I'm not entirely sure where I put this quote. Let me just find it. Hottentot, that's what I said before. And then Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. So we see here really a pattern that just starts repeating in his correspondence with Charles Kingsley. So Kingsley suggested that the superior white race naturally selected against other races, a view Darwin did not dispute. In 500 years, how the Anglo-Saxon race will have spread and exterminated whole nations. And in his published work, that's then also like object of debate, he actually said in The Descent of Man that racial competition, and he actually emphasized racial competition, and he suggested that white groups always won when in contact with Aboriginal populations, like, for example, in Australia. He leaned on research showing supposed correlations between brain size and intelligence across races, placing whites at the top and dark-skinned Australians at the bottom. Implications are that Darwin's private letters reveal a belief in white supremacy and the natural extinction of non-white races. And here is actually a list of, and I need to show it, yeah. So let's rotate it, yeah. So here's a list of passages in The Descent of Man where we actually see that he supports racial hierarchy. So like dark-colored races have a greater sense of smell. So is that racial similarity? No. Is it racial hierarchy? Yes. Then the cranial capacity ranking from 92.3 in Europeans to 81 cubic, whatever it is, cubic inch, I guess. This is no racial similarity, but again, racial hierarchy. And savages will only risk life to save own community. Civilized will risk life of strangers, as weird as that is. Slavery is a great crime. Savages treat women like slaves, torture and abuse animals, show kindness to kin but not to strangers, except Mungo Park. Common experience justifies the maxim of the Spaniard, never, never trust an Indian. So racial similarity is here uncertain, but there is racial hierarchy. The low morality of savages because A, they are only sympathetic to their own tribe, and B, low reasoning skills to see broader consequences of action, C, weak power of self-command, which in the civilized comes through habit, perhaps inherited instruction and religion. So then we have on page 147, civilized man extends sympathies to all in nation, then all humans, then beyond humans, unfelt by savages, except towards their own pet. And that goes on and goes on and goes on and goes on. So we find actually many passages that suggest that Darwin indeed had racist views. Now, how to interpret this? Let's come to the final passages here. Darwin never openly demonstrated the sort of emotionally driven bigotry in the descent of man, so it was not as open, yeah. But it certainly was an inferiorization, yeah. Perhaps as influential. Let's skip this. So we cannot say the same about inferiorization. So he has not an antipathy against like the savages, right? So, but we see here, even with the sin of Brazilian slavery washed away, he believed all uncivilized people would be exterminated. The gap between humans and apes widened. And then, let's see, like scholars came up with two defenses, basically. The first one, that even hinting that Darwin would have supported wrong or malicious ideas means biblical creationists will win. Okay, so the idea here is if we demolish the picture of Darwin as an anti-racist person, then creationists will win. And the second defense is he was simply a man of his time, which interestingly conflicts with him being simultaneously lauded as a man ahead of his time. So, and the author actually makes some good points about how to look at that. So, for example, anthropologist Jonathan Marks responded in the Fuentes 2021 forum, discussing the ideas that are toxic in Darwin's work in addition to those that are prescient and revolutionary helps to make Darwin seem more real and his followers seem less cult-like. And I agree, we should probably discuss the whole person of Darwin, right? And then for the second strategy, in other words, to say Darwin was a man of his time, means to imagine that no prominent voices, or at least non-familiar to him, would be crying out against Darwin's own attitude toward the destruction of Aboriginal populations. But there were such voices, and Darwin knew them well. So, and actually the text lists before some of these voices. So yeah, let's not look at, now I showed it. So this is like one of these pictures that clearly supports this kind of racism. And it claims that the figure in 21 was, I guess, in the wake of Darwin, and old racism received a new scientific justification in the lexicon through Darwin. Let's see what the author writes about it completely. It is a shame Darwin could not have wielded that original Wedgwood abolitionist flame to argue for racial equality. Instead, any scientific argument for racial equality lost credence for at least half a century after Darwin. Dissent became not an egregious example of scientific racism, but all too typical. Scientific texts adopted Darwin's language to justify their racist assumptions with astonishing rapidity following the descent of man. Yeah, and I think this should be definitely also something that we should keep in mind and talk about. And yeah, so if we ask, was Darwin actually a racist? We should probably say yes. Was he simply a man of his time? No, there were voices that were speaking out against this kind of racism. So we have to learn to identify racism where it occurs. I mean, I say that as a white person, right? But so I guess like I'm not the right person to lead this kind of discourse. And actually, I don't know if how much I should get involved in this discourse for these reasons. But looking at Darwin, I think we need to learn to distinguish between the person that we usually put on a pedestal and say it was a genius, and then the real person that had many false ideas that were rooted in a false ideology. And yeah, I just talk around saying he was a man of his time. Well, there were always anti-racist arguments, and maybe we should then emphasize these. Thank you very much. If you want to watch more of such discussion of articles, then please subscribe.